What we saw in cultic groups was, Jack Clark once called it the impermissible experiment. An experiment on changing personality using techniques that no ethical psychologist would ever dream of using. Lying to people, setting things up, tremendous group pressures, vilifying anyone who dissents, disconnecting from people who leave the group, all kinds of social psychological pressures to keep individuals subservient to a leader.
Dr. Michael Langone has spent more than 4 decades studying psychological manipulation, coercive persuasion, and the strange intersection of belief, identity, and control. As the longtime director of the International Cultic Studies Association, he's worked with former members and families and clergy and researchers, trying to understand how ordinary people can give up amazing amounts of autonomy. We discuss his surprising views on God, religion, and cults, and his hesitancy to use labels that are simplistic and lack nuance. Labels like God and religion and cults. His site, Michael Langone, PhD, contains his hundreds of published papers, as well as his science fiction novel that overarches the topic. It's called Called by Name, Birth of a New Christendom. I give you one of the longtime leaders in cult awareness and recovery, Dr. Michael Langone.
Early on, like way back in 1984, I published on the ethics of social influence. It's one of the papers on my website, michaellangonephd.com. And, that, I think, to this day, is what motivates many of the people in the field, including the victims, the former members of groups, because their challenge really, once they come out and they sort of get through the recovery phase where they're between and to the real world and still this sort of fictional cult world, quasi-fictional cult world. Those that stay active in the field are active because they care about the friends that are still in the group. They care about helping people who stumble out. And most people manage the recovery process okay, but for some, it really is devastating. I mean, I take it you're a former member of a group.
Yes, I am.
And I would think that your motivation is mainly to help people. I don't think you're going to get rich with this podcast.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I have a hard time relating to anyone who hasn't been a part of a cult, who spends their life dedicated to cult recovery. Like, it seems like an experience that would be hard to relate to if you had not been in it yourself. Do you have experience with a cult?
No. The closest I often jokingly say the closest I ever came to being in a cult was the big circle in my master's program in graduate school, where we all sat around and had feelings. And I actually look back on that because I see the group dynamics there at play in cults. But I haven't had personal experience. Yeah, and I think the professionals in the field who haven't been personally involved, and many of them have, many come out of cults and go on to get mental health degrees. But those of us who haven't, you're missing some things, but you also gain some things too, because you have a more distant objective perspective. So, for example, in my work as an editor for our journals, I've had to review a lot of articles and memoirs from former cult members. And one of the things I noticed, with some striking exceptions, is that cult members can often tell a very interesting, moving story about how they were, in a sense, made vulnerable to the cult blandishments. And then they encountered the cult, and then it's almost like, well, I was brainwashed, and then all these bad things happened. And they don't really elaborate the transition from being a relatively normal person with normal vulnerabilities to suddenly being subordinate to a cult leader. And I think what I speculate on that is the reason is that if you're in a situation of undue influence, quote, brainwashing, deception is at the heart of it. And if you're deceived, you don't know it. If you knew it, you wouldn't be deceived. So that experience, the actual movement from point A to point B, where at one point you're an independent thinker, and at point B, you're subservient to a group and its leader, is a period of deception and manipulation, and you don't know what's going on, so you don't necessarily remember it. Those who can elaborate on that period essentially are looking back at their experiences and then reconstructing an explanation based on what they've learned after they came out. And I mean, some have done an excellent job of it. I mean, um, it- but yeah, I mean, Lois Kendall, who did what I think is the best dissertation in the field quite a number of years ago, was in a Bible group in England. She had 7 kids. She was the first to leave her group at 16 years old and went through a few years of really crazy wandering. And eventually she got her head together. And gradually, over a period of about 20 years, she got all of her siblings and I think her parents out of the group. But it took her like 20 years to succeed at that. And she wrote a book, which is partly based on a dissertation, partly based on her personal experiences. And I think most ex-members need some help understanding how they got snookered. Just it's like if you have a person who is a victim of a fraud or a con, they don't really know what happened in detail. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been conned.
In my experience, there's also a heavy element of when you abdicated your power of choice about your own life to somebody else and allowed them to make decisions, especially if in retrospect, it feels foolish. There's a need for the other person to be evil, like because surely that wasn't my fault.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, and that's part of the recovery process is as a mental health professional, what I've tried to do with ex-members is help them realize that they may have been vulnerable and they may have done things that were stupid. Uh, Although not always, sometimes it's just pure bad luck of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that doesn't exonerate the cult leader and the group for the unethical behaviors. An analogy would be, a woman who wears a mini skirt walking through Central Park at midnight. Not too smart, but it doesn't mean she deserved to be raped. Maybe she shouldn't have been walking in the park at midnight, dressing provocatively. That might not have been wise, but she's not to blame.
Yeah, well, and it because of the frequently long-term relationship, it feels like maybe even more like a woman who's in an abusive relationship and keeps going back to him and keeps going back to him, and finally she leaves. And looking back on that, there's the shame of like, I should have left earlier. I should have known.
Right, right.
And so how do I explain the decisions that I made? Surely these were not my decisions. I need these. I don't want to. I hate to say take responsibility for it because again, it's not her fault what happened, but also there's the shame of like, I'm embarrassed that it took me this long to come to some obvious realizations.
And I mean, essentially that's a way of saying I wasn't as smart and virtuous as I thought I was. Okay, and just about everybody can say that looking back on their lives. But the difference between the cult member, the battered woman, the woman in the abusive relationship, is they got into a situation that to some extent was bad luck. It's not like women say, "Oh, I'm going to look for a guy who's going to beat me every Friday night." They're not looking for that. They may have personal problems that make them vulnerable to the guys who will do that, who he will, like a cult leader, um, simultaneously project love, but surreptitiously project my love is dependent upon your obeying me. Um, and you're complying with my wishes. And my love can turn into hate and pain at the drop of a hat if you don't obey me. Uh, so, the blame game is almost a misdirection. If you were in that situation, you can learn things about yourself that will make you a stronger person in the future. And that's what most former cult members who go through the recovery process, they become stronger and better people as a result of it because they learn something about themselves. I mean, it's true of people who have dealt with psychological trauma or even addictions. Um, they learn things about themselves that made them vulnerable to the problems they had, and that makes them stronger. But, in a sense, the analogy with addiction would be, okay, as a drug addict, maybe I had certain vulnerabilities that made me more likely than others to try drugs, but it doesn't exonerate the drug dealer. I mean, my advice usually to ex-members is not to fall for the blame game myth. Y- y- You weren't perfect. What else is knows? You happened to get into a place that was a bad place for you. So, for instance, someone who joins a cult that's destructive, change a few things in his life, and he might have joined a Bible group that maybe was a little bit fundamentalist and a little bit weird, but not really abusive. It was just luck that determined which one he joined. Um, I mean, that was, and then there's a certain match of personal vulnerabilities and what the group is offering. I often cite one of the clients I had years ago when I first got into this field, a young man who I don't know, was approached by the Hare Krishnas. And at that time, the Hare Krishnas were known for inviting people to come for a dinner and they'd start their pitch. And he went for the Krishna dinner and he left saying, "You guys are brainwashed." And a few weeks later, or maybe a month later, he's out collecting money for Reverend Sun Myung Moon.
Yep.
The
Uh-huh.
Krishnas, their philosophy didn't mesh with his vulnerabilities, but for some reason the Moonies did. And he wasn't in long, maybe a few months or so, and I think his parents had him deprogrammed, then I saw him in recovery counseling. But it's a complex interaction of what the person brings and what the group brings. Groups vary a great deal, people vary even more. And that's why the simplistic accounts that, try to explain why people join cults can be misleading. I mean, we have to make generalizations in order to communicate, but I always say treat whatever generalizations I say with a grain of salt because there are always exceptions and there's variation, and groups change over time. So the Krishnas, for instance, um, have undergone a genuine reformation at certain higher levels. I mean, I've had long conversations with the Madasa, who's the public affairs director. He's a good guy, and he has sincerely tried to change Krishna to make it less overbearing, less manipulative. And he admitted, this is going back probably 5 or 6 years, that because of the congregational structure of Krishna, there are still gurus who are still manipulative and hurting people, but others aren't. I mean, two exit counselors, I don't know, did you interview Pat Ryan? Was he one of the people?
Yes, uh-huh.
Well, years ago, Pat told me a story. The head of the Krishna organization of Philadelphia once approached him and said, "My son has left Krishna. Can I get a deprogrammer?" Um, and the guy was obviously being facetious, but he could be a normal human being. He came to several of our conferences, but that's the variation, and yet Pat and Joe at that same time were doing exit counselings of Krishna members. Like I think it was the Dallas uh, locale that was particularly manipulative. I may be wrong on that, but it's like certain gurus were troublesome, others weren't. So, do you say, "Oh, Hare Krishna is a cult"? Well, it depends upon which Hare Krishna you're talking about. And even in um, obviously manipulative and destructive groups, you still have a variation. I often will say to my fellow mental health professionals, always remember that we have a self-selected sample. We get the casualties. People who aren't hurt don't pay us money to talk to them. Um, so there are people who can join obviously abusive, manipulative groups and still maintain a level of autonomy even in that. Almost like they can keep their distance from the group. They don't protest, they don't dissent, so they don't sort of come into the leader's radar to get attacked. They just sort of go along, and then one day they say, "I'm out of here." Um, Such people exist, but we don't talk to them because they don't come to us for help because they sort of go on. If you look at some of the sociological literature, you'll find that that's the case, that there are many people who leave who don't come for help. Why some and not others? Again, it's the interaction of the individual and the group, and people are very different and groups are different. And in one of my writings, I use the analogy that suppose you have a mildly manipulative pastor, not a cult leader. It's just that he's a little full of himself and he thinks his interpretation of the Bible is more brilliant than anyone else's interpretation. Okay, and then now you got two people. One is, assertive, isn't afraid to speak up, and he listens to the pastor and he challenges him. And the pastor, he's not really a bad guy. He's just, a little more arrogant than most of us. Um, and they have a relationship that might be a little bit strained at times, but that person doesn't say, "Oh, he's a cult leader." But then you've got someone, let's say, who really is very unassertive, has a difficult time with conflict, and keeps all of his disagreements with this mildly manipulative pastor to himself. Doesn't say it, doesn't challenge it, but just sort of, uh, they stew, all of his grievances stew. And he comes to me and says, "He's a cult leader. I'm glad I'm out of there." So you have two very different perspectives on the same person because the personalities of the two people interact with that person in different ways. Now, that is not to um, exonerate bona fide cult leaders, who can, sometimes they're psychopaths, sometimes they're delusional and they believe their own crap. Um, and sometimes Ben Zablocki, the late social worker, made a very good point at one of our conferences. He said, sometimes cult members drive their leaders crazy. And what he meant, which he explained, I mean, that phrase captured everyone's attention. But what he meant is the adulation that the members direct at the leader over time can go to his head, and he begins to believe his own crap, which at first he might have thought was a useful tool to control people. But then he comes to believe it, and he really becomes to believe that he's really something, and they're going to change the earth. Um, so the interactions are complex. They vary over time, and they defy all of our attempts to pigeonhole the phenomenon.
Well, and I feel like the nuance is a hard message for former cult members to accept, in that, like, their experience was fully that they were manipulated by this group or this individual, and the having to come to terms with the fact that for some people that person was not an evil influence in their life. That's almost like another harm to them, like, because their experience is, again, oversimplified, but like, this person was a bad person. I was a good person. They took advantage of me. They're a bad person. And then for someone else to say, well, no, they weren't a bad person to me. Like, it seems like they have a hard time dealing with that
Oh, yeah.
potential.
Yeah. And a lot of ex-members have gotten mad at me for saying some of the things I say. But it goes back to what you were talking about earlier about the shame and my role in it. Because the reply to that feeling is your relationship with this person is different from someone else's relationship because you're different people and you interact differently. Because you were abused doesn't necessarily mean that someone else who says he wasn't terribly abused is lying. Now, you still have, however, the objective evaluation of the leader. I mean, there are certain features that you can look for that, in a sense, demonstrate that this person objectively, according to all the moral standards of society, is not a good person. You know, I gave the example of the mildly manipulative pastor. You can have the crazed psychopathic pastor as well, who isn't mildly manipulative. He's extremely manipulative, and he lies to people and he sets them up and he's having sex with members of his congregation. You have objective data to say he's that guy's no good. And I think one of the things that ex-members struggle with is determining the extent to which the leader really was a bad person. And in large groups, it can become complex because the leader that you're most responsible to is down in the hierarchy, and he's being manipulated and abused by people above him or her. And yet he's the one that abused you or she abused you. And, do you then turn this person into an evil ogre? Or do you learn to develop a certain amount of compassion and understanding for him as being both victimizer and victim at the same time? And you yourself may have been in that position where you lied to people because you had been convinced that lying was for their own benefit, that you manipulated them, that you tried to separate them from a family member who was causing them to doubt the group. Yeah, I mean, it's just the complexities get mind-boggling sometimes.
Well, when the variable is you, it's hard to not take that personally. Like, if someone else can have a good relationship with this person and I can't, and I was abused, that means that must have been my fault. Not that that's the case, but like, that's what it could feel like. In the same way, like with a battered
Right.
spouse or something, like that person might have other relationships, coworkers or friends. Is like, no, this is a perfectly nice guy. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, well, then what's wrong with me that I bring this upon myself? Can be the feeling.
Yeah, that's the experience of the person in the group. And the challenge of the person out of the group is to deconstruct that experience and recognize that you were a victim of manipulation and abuse, and that you may have had personal vulnerabilities that made you particularly susceptible, but it doesn't exonerate the abuser. It doesn't mean that the rape is okay because you did something that was unwise. Um, and that's the challenge. And the frustration for family members is they see the person when he or she is in the group and is exhibiting what you're talking about. Basically, if I am in conflict with the group, like I'm disobeying or I'm dissenting, something is wrong with me. And the family members want to shake the cult member and say, no, you idiot, you're fine. It's that jerk, but it doesn't work that easily, unfortunately, for most families. And it becomes a very challenging process for the families to figure out how to relate to the cult member in a way that gradually causes him to her to wake up. I mean, that's one of the things the exit counselors do very effectively. They work. I know Pat and Joe spend days with family members before they even will see the person in the cult, because they're trying to understand the family dynamics as well. So sometimes you might have a sibling that has maintained a relationship with the person in the group, but the parents have kind of blown it because, they had all the New York Times articles that show that the group is bad. And the exit counselors try to analyze that complex family dynamic to figure out what the family members can do to help the person still stuck in this self-blame mentality to come out of it.
So, what are some of the best and worst things to do if you're in that situation? You've got someone that you're trying to rescue from that situation.
Well, first thing to say is take everything I say with a grain of salt because people in groups differ and the interactions can be very different. Usually when I have to give parents or other family members advice, the first thing I will usually say is be more prone to listen than to lecture. You do not understand what it's like for your loved one to be in the group. You don't know it from inside your loved one's head. And Pat and Joe make this point a lot in their exit counseling. You want to understand how he or she sees the group. And you can't do that by telling him or her how he sees the group. You have to be able to listen, ask questions, ask more open-ended questions, not questions that get a yes, no answer. Paraphrase. These are standard kind of counseling techniques that are used. Reflect back the feeling in the response so that what you're trying to do is to get the person to think, not to agree with you. Because the problem in a cult is the person has been indoctrinated, brainwashed, whatever, to comply, to agree. And you're not, as a parent, you're not likely to be able to compete with the cult leader when it comes to manipulation. Not only because you don't have the skill, you also have ethical constraints that you won't violate, that the cult leader will violate at a moment's notice. And you also have the parent-child relationship, which is very different from the relationship of, say, a young person and an adult manipulator. So parents should avoid any kind of manipulation because it's not likely to work. There may be some things that you can do. A family may arrange for the loved one in a group to meet with some people without necessarily telling them all about it. That's a manipulative process, but it's not major league manipulation. So, but they have to be careful because as a family member, if your loved one sees you behaving the way you say the cult leader behaves, then you're the ultimate hypocrite.
So then let me ask this, maybe switching gears a little bit. You said you joined in '79, the ICSA, is that right?
American Family Foundation.
Yeah, right. So then was that a kind of a crazy time for cults? It seems like I haven't heard a lot about cults since, like, I don't know, the major ones of the '90s, or like Waco and Heaven's Gates. And it feels like there weren't as many news stories about major cults after that. What's your view of the history or
Well, I
progression
think
of
first you have
cults?
to remember the media cliche: if it bleeds, it leads. Okay, so unless you have some kind of suicide or violent action, it's not likely to be on front page. But when you've got a pastor of a non-denominational church who's a creep, yeah, he's not necessarily going to be seen as a cult, and his group may practice theologically orthodox Christianity, but he doesn't practice according to orthodox theological Christianity. Um, so he, in a sense, is hidden in the weeds. Oh, it's just another church. We've all seen fundamentalist churches and weird people, but they're not bad people. I mean, I have friends that believe in young Earth creationism. I mean, which to me is crazy. But um, we don't necessarily fight over that, and because it's not a cultic dynamic. But you do have nodules uh, within Christianity that are bona fide cultic. And I mean, one of the most astounding examples of that was the Legion of Christ in the Catholic Church. This was a fascinating group that I got into in depth, and I even visited their seminary with the late Father James Labar. They have a seminary in Connecticut. The founder of the Legion of Christ, Maciel, was a Mexican. His uncle was an important cardinal in Mexico. At 22, and at 22 years old, he started recruiting young boys, 13, 14, 15 years old. And at 22 years old, because of his uncle's connections, he got permission. He hadn't even been ordained. He got permission to have his own order, okay, which he named the Legion of Christ. And it became very successful because he was a great con man. He was good at raising money. He knew how to cultivate rich people in Mexico initially, then Spain and elsewhere in the world. He had a great knack for public relations. And in the around 2000, 2003, it first came into our radar because there were some men who had been recruited as boys in the 1950s, who were now in their 60s and 70s, and they had come out of the group and they were speaking up. And they were talking about how he sexually molested them. Um, I mean, my impression, not actual rape, but like in bed, and he's basically diddling with the little boys. Um, and at first, the whole public relations apparatus of the Legion, which by that time was very rich and powerful within the Catholic Church, was directed at stifling the dissent, calling them nuts, just crazy people. They're just unhinged former members. They don't realize that Maciel is a future saint. Um, and I remember there was a special website devoted to the critics of the Legion of Christ, and it had reputable elite Catholics like Richard John Newhouse, who had been a famous convert from Lutheranism and the editor of First Things magazine, William Bennett, the former Secretary of Education, all defending the Legion of Christ. And I can understand how they got snookered, because when I visited their seminary with Father Labar, whoa, it was first class. The seminarians, who were wonderful young men, were attending to our every need, and they had an answer for every criticism. But ultimately, Joseph Ratzinger, who at the time was, what I forget his exact title, but he had an important position under John Paul II, and he started a new investigation, and about a year before Maciel died, Ratzinger put him out to pasture and tried to start cleaning up the Legion. Because one of the things that Marcial had, which helped the Legion hide for so many years, is the seminarians took the normal vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but then they took a secret vow. And the secret vow was not to criticize the Legion or its founder. Now, you're dealing with young men who sincerely believe in Catholicism, and they have taken a vow not to criticize the Legion. And when the Vatican investigator comes and he asks them questions, they're going to obey that vow because they take their vows seriously. So it took a long time before the church as an institution was able to realize, and I credit Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict, for really blowing the lid off of this. And then all of the stories started to come out even within Catholicism. There had been exposés that the Hartford Courant did back in the early 2000s, but that was easy to ignore within the church because, they're just journalists, and you can't trust journalists. They're just anti-Catholic journalists, even though at least one of them was a practicing Catholic. But ultimately, it came to be exposed, and it was almost the classic cult in terms of the manipulation, the control. I'm sure you've heard of Lifton's notion of totalism, of total control. Everything was controlled. What they wear, when they eat, how they set their forks, their dress, what time they get up, when they pray, when they don't pray. Their whole lives were in total control, which it was almost like an exaggeration of normal monastic discipline. And it turns out that not only had Marcial molested young boys and young men, but he had also fathered 2 illegitimate children and had embezzled money. So I mean, this guy was a piece of work, and he snookered the entire church for at least 35, 40 years.
Yeah, well, and I have to think, based on my own experience, 35 to 40 years is a long time for that stuff to develop. I'm guessing he didn't start out on the first year fathering 2 children illegitimately and having a secret vow. Like, I'm guessing that came in at, year 6, 7.
Yeah, but I think his molestation of the boys began early on. That was
Yeah.
part of it. I
Okay.
mean, I wouldn't even try to understand his psyche because it must have been so twisted. And he was actually put forward. I mean, I talked to the priest that headed the seminary, saw Marcial as a future saint. Um, and the reason the Legion story is instructive is it shows how, with sufficient skill and patience, a cult leader can really gain enormous power over people and can shape the public image that he has. See, Marcial was smart in that he kept his focus on the Catholic Church, the Catholic world. So he only had to deal with Catholic press, Catholic leaders, and he had the advantage Catholicism is a hierarchical structure. So you get the people higher up and they can control the people lower down. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a cultic kind of control, but simply, the cardinal tells you that, oh no, Marcial is a wonderful man. He's done this, there's charities, and the seminarians they're such wonderful young men, and you say, I know, but I'm hearing stories. Oh no, that must be false. The people higher up in the hierarchy are not necessarily in on the con, but they perpetuate the con by falling victim to the con.
Yeah. Well, and this once again back to the battered spouse. Like when everyone else who investigates the situation says, no, this is a real nice guy. I don't know what you're talking about. Like you must be making it up. It's all that more frustrating when in my situation, it was similar in that it was like in a religious environment, and everyone it was a smoothly functioning high demand group that everyone from the outside who observed it was like, this seems like a, maybe a little bit more controlling, but you gotta break a couple eggs to make an omelet. Like the product is good, and yeah, I don't know. You guys are all apparently just complaining too much, and so then like finally when the thing fell apart and all the stories came out, it was just like there was decades of denial of these people's experience that like finally.
Was the group a known group? What was the name?
Oh, no, it was just a church that like I think you can get like 80%, 90% of the benefit of a cult if you just like, like what you're saying, stay away from the violent stuff, and if you're not in it for the sex, then you don't have that scandal. So you can embezzle a lot of money and control a lot of people and get a lot of praise. If that's what you're in it for, then you can slide by with a relatively normal organization that's just kind of extreme on the inside the higher up you go.
Well, yeah, I often say that the motivations of cult leaders probably fall into four areas: money, sex, power, and vanity. And don't underestimate vanity. Um,
Absolutely. I think that in our case at least was the one, and what you were saying too about like the part about where your members make you crazy. In our organization, the leaders didn't tolerate any dissent, so it was just a self-selecting population of people who are willing to put up with that. And again, that doesn't make it their fault what happened to them, but there wasn't any chance for the leaders to really change because they weren't open to that, and they didn't have any. There was no pressure for them to change, and no one in their group that was able to say
yeah,
you need to
I mean,
change.
Zablocki's point was cult members make their leaders crazy or crazier. And I think what he was referring to is the reciprocal relationship. So as you describe your group, you've got controlling leaders that stifle dissent, which means they get compliance and agreement reflected back to them, which just makes them all the more confident in what they believe. Do you think that the leaders believed the theology that they were promoting, or was it just a tool to get money or whatever else was motivating them?
I think almost entirely they believed it. There were certain parts, and this might just be normal in clergy as well, where there's, you see yourself as the shepherd of people, and so you maybe coddle them and say things that you in a simpler way than you like. For example, gay rights was a big deal for a long time there, and our leader would privately say, well, I'm conflicted about this, but if I say that I'm conflicted, that might lead some people astray. So I'm going to state it as, more clearly than I actually feel it. So it felt like there might be some nuance, but preached things that he didn't really believe. And that's just one of many examples where, yeah, he was definitely not telling the truth to his congregation, but he felt like it was, a noble lie.
Well,
Maybe.
yeah, and I think that's common not only in religion, in any kind of ideological group. It can be in politics where you you share certain goals with the group, and you have to deal with people who don't share those goals, and you shape your messages to try to bring them in. And that's essentially a manipulative kind of relationship. I've sometimes used the analogy that, well, not so much analogy, but if I'm relating to you in an ethical manner, um, and I would like, let's say, for instance, I'm a committed Christian and I would like to see you convert. I am going to share my story. I'm going to tell you what I believe and why, but I'm not going to try to deceitfully or manipulatively get you to move. As a matter of fact, years ago in the Cultic Studies Journal, I reprinted an article from Christianity Today by A. Duane Litvin, who later became president of, I think, Wheaton, one of the big evangelical colleges. The title of the article was "The Perils of Persuasive Preaching." And Litvin's argument was that he used a psychological model of persuasion. The first step was get the person's attention. The second step is communicate the good news of the gospel. And the third step ought to be, now it's between God and that person. It's not up to you to change him. It's up to you to share the
Right.
good news of the gospel in words that he can understand. Okay, so you may vary your message so that it's understood, but it is not your responsibility to change that person. And that's where the manipulation and ultimately the cultic relationship can come in. When the person trying to influence feels an obligation towards the outcome rather than the message. And that's where 90% of the problems come from. And it's basically lack of respect. And you run into the same thing in psychotherapy. And by the way, we've published articles on psychotherapy cults. Um, as a psychotherapist, your obligation is to respect the autonomy of the client. And it's not your job to change that client. You know, when I was in graduate school, we used to observe each other in the counselor training. And this one woman had a young woman as a client. And the quote counselor thought that masturbation was healthy. And this young woman who had a perfectly satisfying sex life with her boyfriend didn't masturbate. And the counselor had a knockout, drag out fight with the young woman because she didn't masturbate. And then I had a knockout, drag out fight with the counselor when it was
Right.
over. Who the hell do you think you are?
That sounds more like the experience that we had, like, because it's not like there's a clean line of like, well, now I've shared the gospel and now I can if I can't tell when I've fully shared the gospel yet because they still haven't made a decision. And if they really knew the truth, they would make a decision for this. So I should keep pressing until they get this thing because after it's all this, their eternal destiny, like the downsides are infinitely large. So, maybe I'll push a little bit harder and a little bit harder. And again, if you don't have anyone telling you shouldn't be, you're just doing this noble thing of controlling people into heaven, and if you don't believe in hell, but you think that saying that hell exists and that they're going to burn forever is going to help them, then you help them. It doesn't matter what you believe or what you think about their autonomy. Like they'll thank me in the end when they're not burning in hell
Yeah,
forever.
it's sort of, if you don't agree with me, it's because you don't understand. And it's my obligation to get you not to understand, but to agree with me.
Right, exactly. And the only reason you wouldn't is, I guess, if you're evil or you're
Yeah,
stupid.
yeah.
So yeah, as long as you're not evil or stupid, we should keep going.
And one of the things
So.
I've noticed in the French Christian groups, which I like to mock, is the Holy Spirit is really brilliant. He always agrees with me. The classic when I did a research study on the Boston Church of Christ movement, which has been renamed since then. And part of it was I interviewed former members. And one of the things that came repeatedly was when the member was in disagreement with the discipler, because it was a discipleship group, they would pray and to the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit always agreed with the discipler because
Every time.
member was
Every
a
time.
baby Christian. So he or she didn't hear the Holy Spirit as accurately as the discipler did. I mean, it's a great scam. But the thing is, they believed the disciples. The disciples were themselves victimizers and victims because they were low down on a hierarchy. Um, I mean, it's just, and this is what people who don't know anything about cults, I don't think have any understanding of. They're looking for things like Hare Krishnas dressed in Hindu robes.
our leader would have board meetings where they would come in at 7 p.m. They'd be there to make a decision that the pastor had already decided what the decision was going to be. Him and God together, and then he would say, "We're going to lock the door and we're going to pray about this until we all agree, because I don't want to make any decisions that we don't all agree about." But of course, he wasn't going to change his mind, so he just locked the door until everyone was like, "All right, we're going to do what what the pastor says," And that was just the Holy Spirit confirming. We were all in agreement. God spoke to us all. And then of course, being a board member in one of those meetings, if you do that for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and then you leave, like, what was I do? Like, I should have known
were
better.
you a board member?
There's that feeling. No. I was not. It was my dad. I was his son, but I was never on the board.
Okay.
So, but it was, the people who left wanted him to be evil, and I was conned, which I feel like, in your example of, like, the skirt and being assaulted or whatever, like, it's true that thing shouldn't have happened to you, but also, if you don't learn anything from this experience, you're going to go you're going to jump back into this somewhere else. Like, at some point, you need to learn something in this experience. Not that it was your fault, or that, it wasn't, bad things didn't happen to you. But I feel like the word cult, just saying, "Oh, that was a cult and they brainwashed me," then you walk away, I feel like you're going to still be susceptible, maybe, to that same kind of thing if you don't.
Well, you are.
That's what happened.
That's why, as I said, the former member has to look back at the movement from point A to point B and reconstruct it in terms of new knowledge. Frequently, when I've worked with people who came out of fringe Christian groups who still believe in Christianity, and part of their challenge is they don't want to lose their relationship with Christ, but they've been so abused that it's difficult to have that trust. I'll sometimes tell them, only half facetiously, find a boring church. And what I mean is a church where the people aren't going to come at you from every which way and try to get you, "Oh, join us and do this," and they're going to give you your space, so that for a period of time you can relate to Christianity as an individual in your personal relationship. Lois Kendall used a neat phrase. She called it Bible phobia. When she first came out and was going through her recovery process, she could not read the Bible because so many phrases in the Bible had been used to manipulate her. You must leave your family to follow me, or whatever the
Yeah, I can quote them all. Yeah.
we quote dozens of scriptures that were used to manipulate people because they're taken out of context. But the former member who's abused again and again and again with these scriptures, he can't read the Bible without coming across them. And it took her a long time before she could actually read. And I mean, stayed a practicing Christian, but it was a long struggle. And many people have had that same kind of struggle.
I really wish the church better understood that experience, because there's this sense that, like, whether it's the Bible or the worship songs or whatever it is, like, there's some people who just can't interact with that thing, and the perspective from the church, the message from the church frequently is, well, the Bible's a good thing, and if you are having a hard time interacting with it, that probably just shows you need to do that more. It's like, well, I don't think you're going to win that person. Hopefully you won't win that person, because that person needs some space.
The churches and clergy, for the most part, don't understand psychological manipulation.
I think even when they're doing it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I think the kinds of things you describe in your group can be found throughout the history of religion, not just Christianity, but certainly we know Christianity better because it's the cultural default. And I think until recent times, where you have the pluralism and tolerance of the remains of Enlightenment thinking, sitting alongside the Christian tradition. Those Christian churches that can embrace the tolerance uh, and respect for freedom to a degree are out of sync with the history, which was much more my job is to get you to be a good Catholic, a good Lutheran, a good Methodist, or whatever it is. And to be a good Methodist, you have to believe A, B, C, D, E. And my job is to get you to believe that. And sometimes I may use underhanded tactics to achieve that, but it's to save your soul. I mean, I think this is a common thing. When I was a little kid, I'm giving away my age in pre-Vatican II in Sunday school. I was raised Catholic. I still remember to this day the nun who talked about purgatory and the pains of purgatory. And she told the story about a man who had asked the priest to say a mass for him immediately after he died. And the man appeared to the priest after he died and said, "Father, you said that you would say a mass for me right away." And the priest said, "Well, I am. It's only 2 days. You died 2 days ago." "Father, I've been dead for 1,000 years because the pains of purgatory are so great that 2 days feels like 1,000 years." Now,
Yep.
I'm sure the nun didn't believe that story, although it's possible someone else had told her that and she did believe it.
Yeah.
But it was designed to scare the bejesus out of 8 and 9-year-old little kids. And so many abuses and deceptions, many abuses you could call them, have been committed in the name of religion. I mean, and the challenge, in my opinion, for religion, and my novel that I wrote after I retired, called by name, Birth of a New Christendom, the basic theme of it is that if Christianity is to survive and become dominant in culture again, it has to integrate the freedom and tolerance that came out of the Enlightenment, which granted was anti-religious, but that freedom and tolerance really is not contradictory to the fundamental doctrines of Christianity. And I think that's what Vatican II was trying to do. And your theologians like Ratzinger, aka Benedict, were brilliant in expressing that. But the institutional churches are so far behind, and it's really kind of a challenge. And I mean, I don't know what's going on. A lot depends upon whether or not God is real, and if He's the personal God of Christianity or not. If He isn't real, well, we're probably headed for some kind of oligarchical control down the pike. But if He is real, then he's got to clean up His churches.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So either way, I think the recommendation is that the people clean up the churches. If he's not there, then the people should clean up the churches. If he is there, then people should clean up the churches. So fortunately, I think the atheists and the Christians both agree. Christians need to do better.
Well, the atheists have their own problems too, and the fundamental problem.
How dare you?
The fundamental problem is, how do you justify any morality? As Dostoevsky said, without God, everything is permissible. Without, I sometimes say that if there is a God, then morality is real as the wall I can't walk through, or right and wrong is as real as the wall I can't walk through. If there isn't a God, then who's to say? So Stalin killed 20 million people. Yeah, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. On what basis do you argue against what you might consider immoral, abusive behavior? if you don't have some kind of objective morality uh, behind it. It's a matter of preference. I like apple pie, you like pecan pie. Um, I believe in being nice to people. You say, why? If I can exploit them and get more pecan pie.
Yeah, well, in my experience, the dedicated humanists are reducing suffering at as great a rate, or if not greater, than the average current American Christian. So I feel like there is common ground, even if we don't find metaphysical, philosophical common ground, that in the attempt to reduce suffering, like the Christians should agree that we want less suffering, and I think the humanists agree we want less suffering. So I feel like that's something we can all aim for together, while we're also figuring out whether or not there's a God. There's a practical road forward, even if we don't have the ultimate grounding that we wish we
Yeah,
had.
I agree. Those alliances are useful, but ultimately you still have to get to the metaphysical grounding. I mean, as Dawkins said in his book, it's often quoted. I may not have it exactly, but I mean, the universe is just, what is it, a blind, pitiless indifference. Um, and I think he put his finger on it. That is the fundamental problem with a materialistic, atheistic view of life. You don't really have any kind of justification other than to say that I feel that A is wrong. And if enough people agree with me, A is wrong. But that was Scientology's bit. Reality is agreement. Um, so morality is agreement. And that can work because you raise children. Children don't necessarily need to know metaphysical niceties. They just sort of model themselves after their parents, and if the parents are moral, and I agree, most people who espouse humanist philosophy are probably more likely to be honest in their dealings than your average Christian. But I would not identify Christianity only with the average Christian, because you got, what, 1.5 billion of them. So the average probably isn't what you want running the show. You want the elite Christians who have some understanding, but they are also deficient, because I think many of them are still locked in this sort of old Christendom mentality of um, getting compliance and agreement, and not really understanding what you could call the psychotherapeutic um, ethic of respecting the individual's freedom and capacity to make choices. Now, today, I mean, we have at least a relatively educated populace, but if you go back even, say, 150 years, my grandfather was born in 1876. My grandparents were all illiterate Italian peasants. They couldn't read or write. Most of the people in their little villages couldn't read or write. So if you're the priest in that little village, you're dealing with illiterate peasants. You're not going to be talking them about Thomas Aquinas's proof for the existence of God. You're going to be telling them stories like the nun told me, um, and the kids in my class, because and it's not necessarily a bad thing, because it's like um, we're always trying to make the best of a bad situation, and today though there is an opportunity, because we have, at least in the West, but even more so in the developing countries, thanks to the technology of phones and so on. You have a population that's more educated and more educable than previous populations. But I think the elites aren't prepared for it.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. Well, and I'm hoping too that there is. Maybe I'm just naive to think we've got enough common ground in if we could just take out right and wrong as far as the practical steps are concerned, and just deal with suffering and non-suffering, then we've got enough common ground in the second greatest commandment, which is treat your neighbor the way that you'd want to be treated, that we can make a lot of progress together and move forward.
Well, yeah, that's the political hope, and support that. My skepticism is that a certain percentage of the population, I don't know, I think it's 2 or 3%, are psychopaths. And while the rest of us are trying to work together to be good people, the psychopaths are looking at the thing and saying, "How can I exploit this situation?"
And that's why we do need the politics, and why we do need the rules of civilization, is to get rid of the free riders.
We have to understand that psychopathic mentality, and that's where the cult education comes in. Because to a large extent, what you're dealing with is a psychopathic mentality, even if the people exercising it are not technically psychopaths themselves.
Absolutely. I say that there's nothing that a psychopath can do that a non-psychopath can't do with the right story. It's just a matter of whether or not you again have a narrative that tells you, well, normally this would be a bad thing, but either God said it, or it's for their own good, or you just need the right story, and both sets of people are capable of the same atrocities. So I'm not nearly as concerned about the psychopathic actions, because I think they're the same actions as the non-psychopathic.
You're getting to a good point, which brings up the whole psychological research on conformity and compliance. The Nazis took over Germany mainly because the majority of Germans went along to get along, not because they had convinced them. Okay, so in a sense, the psychopath was able to get power because the masses enabled them to get power. And again, this comes back to the whole notion of the education about psychological manipulation. And I mean, we should be teaching it in school, but it's a tough sell because so many people make money, achieve status or power through psychological manipulation. Just look at your advertising industry. I mean, young people they're marinated in psychological manipulation through the advertising. I mean, I can remember even when I was young with the advertising, I would see girls that would throw their heads back and their long hair would flow back. It was right out of the ads on television. That's what they did. Yeah, and y- you know, uh, as a guy, hard drinking, because you got all I don't think they have them anymore, but we used to have ads for beer and alcohol and smoking. You're smoking, you're really cool. You're smoking your cigarette. You're a cool guy. I mean, you look at the old movies from the 40s and 50s, they're all smoking. Everyone is smoking.
Only the doctor recommended brand.
Yeah, but that changed when
Yeah.
there was an educational campaign.
Well, and this is my hope. Again, maybe naively optimistic here, but I don't feel like I have another choice other than the darkest version of nihilism, and that is with each new generation and each new type of psychological manipulation, eventually a large group of people, if not the majority, have realized, oh, this thing was bad, and so now we kind of get inoculated against it. The question is whether or not the novelty of change, of psychological manipulation, outpaces our ability to combat it. But I feel like even my kids their groups realize the amount of screen time you have and the amount of social media you consume is not good for your head. In the same way that like my generation realized probably so many carbs, even though like you're supposed to have 12 according to the pyramid, like that's probably not the right thing to do. Like we figured that one out, even though the messaging was this is what you should do. Eventually we experimented and realized this isn't going to be a healthy thing, even though we're drawn to it. We're going to intentionally move away from it. I feel like my kids and their generation is moving away from this thing, and I'm hopeful that we'll keep finding ways to get around the thing that's trying to control us, and that we will see the humanity in each other. But I don't know. Time will tell.
I share your hope. And I don't think we have any choice because
Right.
You have to work to try to make that hope come true, even if your uh, gut tells you that it's going to fail. Because I mean, I don't know about you, but I've been wrong a lot of times in the past. So if I have a pessimistic feeling, I ignore it in the hope that it's wrong, and that hopefully we can make things better. I mean, in many ways, the world is better. I mean, certainly the advancement of science and the humanistic mentality that came out of the Enlightenment has made a better world that is more um, compassionate than the old world. I mean, even just in terms of tolerance alone, in my parents' generation, ethnicity, and my parents were born in 1911, 1913, so I'm older than you. So it's probably your grandparents or even great grandparents. But their worldview was shaped by ethnicity. Italians did this, Jews were like this, Irish were this way, and intermarriage among ethnicities was relatively rare. Um, and you had all kinds of stereotyping, um, and I think it's much less today. Now, the woke stuff takes it to another area. That's a whole other discussion. I think that takes it uh, to another crazy area. But the maybe the 90s, the early 2000s was sort of the peak where we had genuine tolerance and respect at a higher level than ever before. The challenge going forward will be to for the elites, because I mean, I don't want to sound like an elitist, but the fact of the matter is that you have certain people who dominate the world of ideas, and ultimately the world of ideas influences the world of action. Um, and I think it's in the world of ideas that we need a lot of work. And as I said, I think, I mean, my view is we need a new Christendom, uh, and whether it'll come to pass is another point. I mean, the atheistic secular. I mean, actually, in my novel, it begins. It presumes the victory of the World Economic Forum and the transhumanists. They create a utopia, a apparent utopia. Uh, and it may happen, but I think any kind of secular utopia would be built on sand. But that's another discussion.
Yeah, well, I think that definitely Christianity is going to change because it has never not changed. So it's constantly been evolving. I think maybe my own perspective is slightly behind the secular morality evolution, but it feels like it's got better grounding. But whatever, I feel like we have done a pretty impressive job. Frankly, I mean, the world was supposed to end a lot of times. The printing press should have ended humanity.
Yeah.
The telegraph was supposed to end humanity. The internet was supposed to destroy us all. We've survived. Like, the fact that we created atomic bombs and we haven't blown ourselves up yet. Like, even if we blew ourselves up tomorrow, I feel like we still made it another 100 years longer than I would have expected these primates to do with these bombs. Like, good job, guys. Like, we made it 100 years and then we destroyed ourselves. That's longer than anyone should have expected.
Yeah.
So the fact that it looks bleak from where we're standing is, I feel like it's looked bleak before, and we do need people to take the steps of loving each other and pretending like maybe there's a path forward, even if we can't see it.
Okay, well said.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Okay, it's been fun. You take care.
Thank you all for joining me. There is a link to Michael Langone, PhD, in the description. There's tons of free information there and a science fiction novel you should buy. Hopefully it's obvious that I spend considerable effort putting these together so you can have them for free. So now it can be your turn to give me something for free by clicking that like and subscribe button. Also, my free almostoccult.com newsletter sign up is in the Superfans link. I think it's really cool that you're rooting for me. I'm rooting for you, and I think you should too.